Hi, welcome to the Three-Sided Dice Podcast. I am Take Two Tom, and with me I have Jared and Nick. Would either of you like to introduce yourselves again?
Hi, I'm Jared. Nick, you were unmuted. Now you are muted.
Fuck. Hi, I'm Nick.
We're off to a great start tonight, everyone.
Yeah, this is doing great.
This is the second attempt. I'm just gonna roll with it. So tonight we're talking about player characters and NPC character writing. For the most part, we'll see where it goes, as we have no semblance of train of thought or practical. We have no real story map in front of us.
Yeah, we really just keep talking.
Yeah.
That's it for
That's
45
really
minutes to an hour. So come along for the ride.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
Have fun.
I guess I'll start with player characters. So I talked in a couple other episodes about player characters that I tend to default on, and I think I have like my triangle. I have mage who's a coward. I have rogue with a dark backstory. I know, very original. And then I have guy with swords.
Also very original.
Yeah, no, I am as
Pushing the
original
envelope.
Yeah.
I'm as original as a brick wall sometimes, but it do be that way sometimes. So
It really do be.
there is a reason for those though. And I guess there's a lot of reasons, just because I'm not a smart man and I don't like to think hard, and nothing is easier than just swinging a sword or casting firebolt. And I love that. It could entertain me for hours, and that's fine with me if it's fine with everyone else. But each one of those characters is based off of something in another medium that I have drawn from. And this might surprise you. It's mostly anime.
What? That's crazy. You watch anime, Tom?
Yeah, I'm a closet weeb.
What the?
That's
I
a
never
closet
knew.
weep.
I mean, closet to the podcast, I guess.
That's
guess
true. This
that's
is the
fair.
first time I think we've managed to talk about anime.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a whole other episode, I guess.
Yeah.
I promise you, no part of me wants to do an anime episode.
Good. Then I'm comfortable.
Were you uncomfortable before?
Mm.
I was when we brought up anime, yeah.
Oh well, I have some bad news for you.
Oh no.
It's gonna come up again. Tom, tell us more about these characters inspired by anime.
Yeah.
All right. Well, actually, the sword guy is guy with sword is actually just the anime pro tag, because as it turns out in anime, the coolest not the coolest, but one way you consistently see main characters fights is with swords or some other melee swingy weapon. So like
Yeah.
I grew up watching anime. I still watch anime. And some of like my favorite like trashy shonen protagonists are like you have Kirito from Sword Art Online who swings swords. You have Ichigo from Bleach who swings sword. And like those two in particular I really loved. So it's like, of course I'm gonna want to make a character that at least somewhat embodies their powers. But I don't want to like just straight up take. No one wants to actually play Ichigo or Kirito, because as far as characters, they're not that interesting. They're really not. And I feel like a lot of shonen anime characters aren't necessarily interesting, but there's still aspects of those characters that I like. So when I say I steal my characters from anime, I guess what I mean is I just take one or two aspects and then build a unique character around that and around like my triangle of three. I guess like my trilogy of characters, I just build something around that, if that makes sense. You guys follow me?
Yeah, would you
that's
say
right.
you're building like off of the archetype of those characters? Is that maybe a better way to put it than the three thing, or does that not fit?
I don't know. It's like because like I said, in terms of like their personalities and like how they play off, like I don't think they're very interesting. But also, having a shonen main character in a D&D group, I feel would be fucking awful.
Yeah, that'd be bad.
Yeah, it's awful.
Don't do that.
No, like nobody wants to DM for a guy who thinks they're the center of attention the entire time, and nobody wants to play with someone who thinks that they're the sole hero of the story and acts like it.
Unless, of course, you're running like a one-on-one campaign, but that changes the rules
Well,
fundamentally.
that's different.
Or
That's a
or
very niche
unless-
scenario, though.
Yeah, it's one that's a very niche scenario. Or you could do the classic anime, everything's my story thing if you make it the funniest bit of all time.
Yeah, and even that
That might be its own-
genuinely needs to be the funniest bit of all time. Otherwise, all your friends will hate you. So
Yeah.
you know,
I
you're
think
walking
it
a fine
depends
line.
on the party, and like I, every table is different, as we've said before. But it has to be something that people are okay with. Because playing a character and playing a bit, as long as it isn't intrusive, I don't think anyone really minds, unless it's like overly obnoxious or really.
Well, yeah, I
frustrating.
think that depends pretty heavily on the not only the table but the sort of tone expected for that campaign, right? So if you go into it with a session 0, which you should always have a session 0 if you're looking to launch a campaign, talk about expectations and set up connections and all that. If you establish at the session 0 that you're looking to run a more serious campaign that is going to touch on some heavy topics and make sure everyone's comfortable with that, and then some guy comes in with Boblin the Goblin, it's going to be bad. It's not going to fit with the tone of anything else in the group. It's not going to be what anyone expected. And that can be good for a bit, especially in campaigns like that, because sometimes, you know, humor will liven things up. But you don't want to be directly against the gears of everyone else in a campaign.
Yeah. It's almost like a sort of unified tone is sort
Exactly.
of required for characters. Even if you can have like a depth of tones or multiple
And you
tones,
likely should.
you likely should, just to spice it up. It doesn't it like real life. It is both serious and hilarious sometimes.
Yeah. And
So,
similarly, just like if you're running a more loosey goosey sort of campaign, you probably don't want to come in with the rogue whose entire family clan was murdered.
yeah,
That might put a damper on the mood that people are going for.
yes.
I guess when we bring up campaign tones, and to just recenter on like the characters I've made and the characters we make, I tend to play more serious campaigns, so I think that also affects who I make. I don't think I've ever done like a truly like happy-go-lucky, lighthearted campaign. I don't think any of my characters would be really fun there. I might make someone entirely different, or I just default to my fourth option, which is just roll random to force myself to play someone else.
Yeah, I know personally as a DM, the vast majority of the time I'm not super interested in running like a fun and loose campaign. I tend to prefer more focused ones that aren't necessarily serious all the time, but that do. Personally, I want the capability to touch on heavier topics, right? At least sprinkle them in without it feeling like it's come out of left field. So that naturally lends itself toward slightly more serious campaigns. But with that said, a lot of one shots I've run using various systems. Specifically, the Fate system I use a lot for one shots with different people, especially if it's just sort of an unplanned thing. And those are almost always just goofy. So the system, I'm sure, plays into it a little bit as well. But yeah, I think you can establish a tone both for the overarching campaign and for the individual sessions, and even finer than that and more relevant to the point, for individual characters.
So you said you've mostly run serious, but like you've done like a couple of like fun or lighthearted one shots, right?
Yeah. Like pretty much every campaign I've run has been more serious,
My question for you then, to further pivot away from where we originally started, is
Oh yeah.
do you enjoy the characters? Do you think you enjoy the characters more in the fun one shots or the long form campaigns? And I know like I feel like it might be a little biased towards one or the other just due to length of time, but I want your take on it.
Yeah, so actually, I think that length of time plays a pretty pivotal role in it. I think most of the time, and this could just be the people I play with often and the way we as groups approach the game. I think fun and slightly silly characters shine a lot more in shorter time bursts. You know, so in a similar situation, let's say I'm talking about a serious campaign. And I realized that, oh boy, it's been getting pretty dark lately. And I introduce a silly, ridiculous NPC in for like a session or two. Pretty much everyone's going to like that because it's such a tonal shift that it'll change the mood up and it'll get people thinking about it in a different way. I don't think it would be successful. Oh boy. I don't think it would be successful to introduce a goofy character into the world that sticks around often. just because in general, again, it sort of doesn't match the mood. So I think serious characters need a little bit more time to develop into interesting arcs, and I think silly characters inevitably over the course of a long story will grow a little bit more serious due to the nature of TRPGs, because you face increasingly more dangerous threats, and that has a tendency to cause people to stiffen up a bit.
At the same time, so there's this sort of like balancing scale that tends to happen, at least as far as I see, where like serious characters usually end up being prodded to be goofier.
Exactly.
Goofy characters get prodded to be a little more serious sometimes, mostly because at least for the things that we run, there's a variety. One, there's a variety of things that can happen just in terms of your imagination. Two, not everything is guaranteed, and some things might just have silly, stupid results that your characters need to react to. Like your super serious character, a noble paladin named Steve. I don't know.
We've done great with Sirius so far.
Yes, we've done great with Sirius so far. But your noble paladin character is eventually going to get to the position where he has to live through an awkward conversation with like he's trying to buy time for the rogue to steal something, and he has to keep up a guys with like the bank teller or something. And that's just a hilarious scenario. That's just funny. And
yeah, made even better by their seriousness.
Exactly. So in comedy, a serious character can still be funny. It's very rare that a comedic character can be serious when necessarily in a serious scenario. So like there's a utility for a serious person in a comedic scenario, which is like the straight man, the one that's just not reacting right to the situation. Not necessarily comedic, not overtly comedic, not goofy, but still is like a cog in that sort of machine. Whereas a funny character is going to need to mine for some depth when the drama comes up, because there's not necessarily a place for just a funny bone cog in that machine.
Yeah, and I feel like so often in established media with like written stories, when they try to get the comedic relief character to have a serious arc, it often starts out with them just getting like laughed out of the room for trying to be serious. Like they get ignored when they bring up an issue, or everyone thinks they're continuously joking and stuff like that. And that inevitably can be a character growth moment in itself, but you don't necessarily want to need to go through that for an entire series of characters if you're dealing with the overall tone of the campaign shifting.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I guess my next question for you guys is, and I'm gonna get back to this in a little bit, but I want to pivot to something else quickly. Do you find that like have different writing styles for NPCs? I think we also touched on this in the last episode, but we put a pin in that then because there's a lot of depth we could go into. So we just talked about like the growth of like the silly characters, or like the silly characters being forced to be more serious and vice versa. Do you feel like you've had the time and ability to do that at any campaigns with NPCs you've written specifically as a DM? Or I guess even if you've seen it as a player at another table?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think any character that sticks around long enough will, NPC included in that, will become multifaceted, which is really what we're talking about here. It doesn't have
It's
to.
important for any good writing, honestly.
Yeah, regardless of how you define the character at the beginning, you're gonna introduce multiple, reasons and goals and reactions and stuff like that. Yeah, I mean, quite a few NPCs, and I think it's important so that players are kept on their toes while talking to them as well. You don't want to have the mob boss act like a 60s gangster all the time, right? You want to introduce some different things in it so that players can get a kick still out of those conversations, because while you're trying to tell a cohesive story, it's also a game which should be enjoyed.
Yeah, it is basically a group entertainment activity, which means that you're going to need to find the entertainment And the best way to do that is small little comedies, and to sort of I don't want to. It might sound demeaning, but to like hold over until those big dramatic catharses can come out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well,
And also off that, I mean, NPCs can, assuming they're the type, can pretty easily play off of player characters too, and that will change how what they do, as well as hopefully influence and grow the player character, which will keep them further engaged in the game as well. One thing I'm thinking of, the reason I brought a mob boss before, one of the characters I made, his name is Clay Robinson. He runs one of the mob, like he runs the major mob syndicate in one of the major cities. One of the characters in that campaign, one of the player characters, his name is Jax. Has idealized becoming a hero, and Clay picked up on that, and he now just kind of prods that with Jax every time. So every time he asks the group to do something and he sees they're a little bit iffy, he'll turn to Jax and somehow throw in some reference to how it's a heroic deed, and then Jax will often turn around and try to convince the rest of the group to do it. So the characters can do that and change how they interact with people, which is really what they are in this context, to further their own goals.
I feel like that's how it should be, though. I mean, player character NPC interpersonal interaction is going to be a cornerstone of any role-playing game, even if you downplay the role-playing for more, I guess, game mechanics like combat or roles. Like it's almost really hard to ignore the fact that you're playing as a character, whether it's an NPC that the DM has, or your own character, or just acknowledging the fact that your buddy at the table is also playing a person. One thing that I do find, though, and I do think it's just because of the way D&D is, and not to say that this is a bad thing, just an observation, it's that even the best NPCs often are going to be less developed and defined than the player characters. So
Inevitably.
yeah.
Inevitably, yeah.
And once again,
a screen
like,
time issue.
Mhm.
I don't even think it's an issue. I just think it's just a fact of D&D or anything where, like, there's going to be main characters, since we've talked about anime or other media. Like, you have your main group, and those are going to be the people that get a majority of the time in front of you. So I guess I, as a DM and as a player, but mostly as a DM, I look... Oh, excuse me.
You're
Alright.
excused.
I guess I look to... I play with my NPCs a little bit differently. I still want them to have growth, but I guess it's a lot... I try to get the most out of little moments where my player characters have a lot more time and options to grow, and it feels a little bit more natural. Or not natural, but like more gradual of a build-up. If that makes sense. You know what I mean, guys? I don't know if I'm describing this well.
I actually don't think I do know what you mean.
Alright, so I'll try to use an example. So I guess in my old... I'm going to go back to our very first campaign we played together, which was Traveler. I don't know if you remember much of my main character there, but he was a pacifist to a fault, but was still, like, big ambitions. And over the course of the campaign, it was really small, and it was very subtle, but it's like, he didn't, like, do a full 180, but, like, by the end, like, he was willing to, you know, sacrifice a few lives and, like, let some people die to get things done, if he had to. Where in the beginning, it's like, no, all life is precious. I am not leaving this enemy behind to blow up in the ship. He's coming with me. And that was able to happen over the course of a couple of months, over the course of many sessions, where my NPC, like, probably won't be in every single session over the course of, 12 weeks. So if they want to have that same growth, I find that, like, I introduce bigger moments that kind of force their hand, or, like, force them to reevaluate right there in front of the party and then move on from there in an instance where, say, my character could have that growth over the course of, say, 5 moments or 5 sessions.
Yeah, so like Jared said, like Jared mentioned earlier, I think that's a screen time issue sort of vibe, and I think
Which, again,
the way you
I don't
presented
think
it
that's an
is
issue, though.
No, but I mean, like
Well,
the reason
it's
that has to happen is due to screen time, right? So the fact is that if so let's say there's a pacifist NPC who the character sees once every, let's make it even fairly consistently in a campaign. Let's say they see this person every 3 to 4 sessions, right? If they come back one session and this once pacifist is suddenly slaughtering people in the name of pursuing their goals, that's whiplash, right? So they have to, as you presented it, they have to face growth or change moments like that with or in front of the party, or at least have the party hear about it from others, like sort of an off-screen cycle. But otherwise, it's just going to feel kind of ridiculous as a player.
Yeah, that's what I mean though. It's like because of that, I feel like NPCs and characters, well, while they are all characters and you try to make them all feel at least realistic for the world you're playing in, they're intrinsically going to be different in how we write them and how we play them. At least to some level, in terms if you want them to grow and change.
no, they absolutely will be different. It's both like in the like very plain sense of they are steered by the DM who has more information than the players of the PCs. So there's already the sense of a trajectory that a DM might see rather than what a player might see. And on top of just what is this, like the interest of the player, what is this NPC doing when they're not looking? Is that substantial enough to change their character? Should it change their character? Um, like Nick was saying, you have to boil the frog. You can't just. It has to be like small changes incrementally, and if players don't see those small incremental changes, it's going to come out of left field. And sometimes you want that. Sometimes it can be a consequence for not talking to an NPC for so long that they're alien to you or they have changed, and that's a fundamental thing. But if that's not what you're going for and you want them to recognize their friend, then it's a problem.
Yes. Yes. That's exactly what I was trying to get out, and you successfully did that in a sentence, and I took 3 weeks.
But yeah, with that, I think Tom, I think back at the beginning of your 3 minutes, you mentioned that you try to boil down you try to make the small moments special with NPCs so that players will want to come back or continue engaging with them. And I think that's really important when you're writing NPCs, is to realize, sort of have them graphed onto or attached to a character's, whether one or the whole party's goals or backstory, or make some connection point with that they can revisit every so often. Basically, provide the characters with a reason that they want to go back to that NPC, and preferably that reason should also connect to, as Jared mentioned, the NPC's goals. So when I'm writing an NPC, I think I've talked about this before, but I'll touch on it briefly. When I'm writing an NPC, the first thing I do with any NPC is establish what is their major goal, right? What are they pursuing, regardless of whether or not this party shows up? And then once you have that, then that can dictate how they're going to interact with the player characters, which, as we also previously just mentioned, is going to inevitably end up defining their character, because it's the only way players get to see them. One of the main way players get to see them. So once you have a goal in mind, and if it's a big NPC, if it's someone you expect them to see often, I'd establish a few goals. Then that dictates that character and their interactions with the players, and how those small moments will come up, and that's how you make them memorable.
Yeah. That's one
Yeah.
way to do it. I'm sure everyone has their own writing style, but or
Well,
how they
that's
like to go about it.
I was just gonna say I do something similar to that, but on top of I have a very screenwriter approach, classic. But it's important to understand a character's wants, their goals, exactly what they're aiming for, and everything like that. But the second thing, and probably on the same sort of pedestal I put wants, is needs. So that's a less conscious thing that they are looking for, or even just something they don't know about themselves, and that time with players is going to explore more. So does a So it's like a difference between this person wants like all of these people killed. That is their goal, is to get rid of these people. But maybe their need is to understand that these people are important for their community, or a need to um, be convinced that their methods are unorthodox or need to be changed, or something along those lines. Something sort of out of their control that they might not even understand. And that's it's a little more linear because it comes from script writing, but it can help sort of, for me it's a way for player characters and players to pay attention to NPCs, to see the sort, to make opinions and ascertain sort of like to put, to let them put a hand on the steering wheel, so to speak. So a character can identify something in an NPC and say, "Hey, my character would say that this seems a little bit extreme," and maybe they would try to convince them one way or another, or something along those lines. And that gives them this sort of impact on the final result. If they can get them to their need in time, maybe they don't want their want, that sort of thing.
Okay, so like you factor in like what could be basically a big, or I guess a major character arc for them, if I'm understanding that right.
Pretty much, yep. I
So
try to at least do like the outline of an arc whenever I make a character.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
I
I don't
I
think
like that a
I've never
lot,
heard of that,
actually.
but that's really
I
cool.
I also put it when I do something similar to that when I'm writing like not RPG characters, which again, as Jared said, it fits very well in pretty much every other mold. And I think it can fit well here too. The way I approach that sort of vibe with less of a character arc and more of a, oh, well, sorry, let me start this over again. I think I approach it less from establishing them as a for a character arc, and I think I establish it more as a, how do they, how are they willing to achieve those goals, um, which will also help sort of bring up questions of, is this way too extreme and will this prompt a reaction from the characters? Is this too tame for them to notice? How far are they willing to push themselves? How far are they willing to push others? That sort of vibe. But the needs thing, I think, is much more open than that. It can lead to quite a few more options, which is interesting. I'll probably try that for some future characters for
Do
RPGs.
it.
But my process, I guess, has just, there are 3 bullet points I like to hit on, and the first one, like I think both of you mentioned, is I like to say, I like to look at what their major goal is, and that could be like they want to ascend the throne, they want to avenge someone, they want world peace. Like, what is their primary driving force? And then after that, I like to put anywhere between 1 to usually 3 small goals or small desires. So like those could be some things. It doesn't even have to be a specific event. It could be like this character wants to continue to spend time with another NPC or another player character. This person wants to visit the countryside. Not major goals, not things that define their character arc, but things they keep in the back of their head that also inform their decisions. Sometimes. It's not always going to be the major thing. And then I guess the third bullet point is, what is their foil? Like what is something they can't stand, or like they fear, or something they cannot deal with? And often that is another character or a traumatic backstory experience that could come up in some way.
In screenwriting, we call that the shadow.
Yeah, I didn't really have a word for it. I'm not a screenwriter, but that's cool to know.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the obstacle, whether physical or
Yeah, obstacle. That's a word.
obstacle. But yeah, it's this idea that their goal or their drives or whatever are not going to be easy, and escalating just how not easy it is progressively over the arc of a story reveals more of their character, and that's what builds investment.
Yeah, I guess I'll tack on something to the obstacle or the shadow, as you call it. Is how I like to think about how will they react to said obstacle. Because if there's an obstacle and then they ignore it or they just like are indifferent towards it, it's not much of an obstacle. They have to have some kind of reaction.
Yeah, that's the moments of high
Yeah.
stress that build character. Exactly.
So that also helps me know like how they react when they're not just straight chilling and they're having a bad time. And I guess with those three, that helps me not necessarily make a complete character from the start, but like it helps me fill in enough of a character that I could kind of build the rest from there, or fill in any gaps I need to as the moments progress based off of how they act there.
Yeah, I think that's a really important topic to touch on for NPC writing and player character writing, which I want to pivot to in a second. But you are never going to have the opportunity to fully establish a character out in writing before it enters the game, or rather, you can, but it's going to quickly fall apart. The goal, I think, when establishing NPCs, especially because you need to establish so many of them through a campaign, is just in the interest of time, is just get it to the point where you can feel comfortable enough playing that character to fill in gaps. And even if a gap you fill in doesn't match with your initial idea of the character, that's fine. You can pivot it away, or you can reframe it as if they were lying or something like that if it's really important. But try to get it to where you can play in the game, touch upon it, and react. Other than that, there's not too much you can do.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest points of advice I gave in one of the early episodes is to know enough to improvise, and
Yep.
that extends to your characters. Absolutely, you are not, as much as you might think you are the master of their destiny. You are not the master of their destiny. You are a partner in the creative process for deciding what happens to them. And
Yeah, you are at most the master of their destiny before literally any outside interference
Yep.
in a story being told by at least 3 other people.
Exactly.
It's not going to stick.
It's gonna get messy one
Yeah.
way or another.
So I guess one thing that I guess with NPCs I have this problem more than player characters, but sometimes you just have to make an on-the-fly decision, and then later you're like, I don't know if that's really true to the character. I guess my character's just gonna evolve now, or you have to walk that back somehow. More often I just run with it unless it's just really egregious, but I feel that no matter how well fleshed your character is, like you said, like you're never gonna be fully done. And you're going to have to improvise something because your players are if they're anything like mine, they are creative bastards. They will throw things at you you have never expected, and you just
Yeah.
have to run with it.
And I
But-
think that's important. That'll come up with player characters too. And I think it's important, and it could create massive character moments to address things like that. Where, yeah, it might have been you as the player making a mistake in what you think the character would do. But then, I mean, you can easily spin that into, well, why did the character act like that? Right? What thing from that conversation, from that combat encounter, from that absurdly difficult puzzle, whatever it is, what prompted that response and why? And then you can think about that and apply it to the character in the future, or talk about it with their the other people in the adventuring party and flesh that out, make a new backstory point. That's why it's so important to not establish any character like they're set in stone before playing.
Well, I think there's a difference though between having a character that grows and just a really shaky character.
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, if you walk away from every session feeling like that wasn't a character, then you need to take some time to figure out the character more.
Yeah.
But inevitably, I think it's going to happen a few times, and that can be a really good opportunity.
Now, you said you feel that this happens with player characters too, and while I'm not going to disagree, I feel like I've had more of an issue, or not an issue, but like it's come up more with NPCs than it has player characters, and I think that might just be because like I'll play my player character in a D&D campaign that I'm playing my player character 100% of the time, or observing the world either as myself watching on the sideline or as my player character the entire game. Whereas a DM, you have many hats, and you're not always in that character's mindset or have that character's interests just pulled up and ready to go in front of you, because there's a lot more going on and a lot more moving parts for you behind the screen.
Definitely, yeah. That's happened a few times actually. Actually, it happened in the last session I played with with both of you and the rest of the group. One character introduced, I ended up doing an accent for that I didn't want to do, and because I tend to default to that accent when I'm playing an asshole of a character, no one in the group liked the character, and for a few other reasons, also didn't really fit with the way I intended her to be.
Oh, I didn't like that character one bit. You were right.
Yeah.
I didn't think that strongly one way or the other.
Well,
But I wasn't in. My character wasn't there, so I.
True. Yeah, you guys were just sort of hearing it afterward, but yeah, it changes things a lot, and that's one of those things where if that character were like my player character, that likely wouldn't have happened. But it did happen, and now it's my responsibility to sort of take that and either run with it or adapt to it in the moment and change it up. So yeah, characters are fluid. I think across the board, player characters and NPCs are fluid. NPCs, though, they need to be a little bit more flexible, just by virtue of, as Tom said, you're wearing so many hats that inevitably you're going to get them mixed up at some point.
And you said there's another point you wanted to bring in. So if you think you could bring that up now, that would be cool. If not, I have something else I'd like to talk about. It kind of ties into the whole NPC/player writing.
Yeah, I was gonna. We focused a lot on NPCs, and I figured it would probably be helpful to talk about player character writing and see how some of the topics we were talking about for writing solid NPCs could be applicable to player characters. Because I think it can be difficult to sort of look at a blank sheet or just a blank character sheet and think, how am I going to flesh out these numbers into a living character in some fantasy or sci-fi or other world. Yeah, so I mean, basically, the thing that prompted it was, Tom, you mentioned you have your 3 little points for writing an NPC of goals, foil/shadow, and minor goals. Do you do that when you're writing player characters? Do you have another process entirely? This goes for either of you, obviously.
So I guess it's a similar process, but it's not necessarily the same, because for for NPCs, that triangle is basically, I guess I do the process in reverse. So I start off with my NPCs with that triangle, and then I build their backstory, or I guess I build them kind of side by side, where with player characters, assuming I'm not rolling random, which I do a lot these days, I have at least an idea of my backstory first, and based off of that backstory, I try to fill in the triangle and then flesh everything else out. Or like I have a backstory concept and idea, and I usually play to that, because when you play the same triangle of guy with sword, wizard, and then rogue repeatedly, the weapon, the mechanics don't matter to me as much as the person behind the weapon and the abilities.
I go completely differently because I think I mentioned it before that the way I make at least player characters, PCs, is that it's mechanics first. Because that's the tool, that's the mindset of the person that you're making, really, because this is how they address the problems that they run into in a very physical extension of themselves, both in terms of like very specific to 5e. You come up with backgrounds, their class has a lot to say about who they are necessarily, and then some of that gets developed as you go. But I always start with this is what I want to play, and then from there I say to myself, why would someone behave like this, essentially. In the system I created, Tales of the Magical West, I basically force people to come up with it that way in either direction. So you get like abilities to start off from your upbringing almost completely. You have to basically navigate the backstory to get to the character, even in like a looser sense. So it's you figure out how they were raised in terms of like what family did they have, if it was like conventional family, a poor family, a rich family, something like that, and then where they learned, and then from there you decide what they learned at those places. So it's very much a connection between the narrative and the mechanics, which is what I really love about games. That's why I play games with narrative elements, is because of the ways that gameplay can rub off on story.
Yeah,
What
I
about
think
you?
that's super interesting. When I make a character, I follow for the very first step of establishing what is their major goal. I kind of just replace that with, and it tends to get to the same sort of answers with why did you start adventuring in the first place? And then after that, I kind of just run with it. I establish what Jared said actually was very interesting to me. With mechanics dictate how the character like physically deals with their problems. I tend to disconnect those two until the end, and oftentimes I have difficulty stitching them together. So I feel like switching it up to do that a little bit earlier would be helpful. But after establishing why they're going adventuring, I figure out how they're adventuring. How are they dealing with these issues? And rather than doing it mechanically, I tend to do it story-wise first. But as I said, I run into that grafting issue. Yeah, I mean, after those two, like those two quick bullet points, I kind of just run with it and let the character develop. Most often, I find I have more difficulty sticking to a character than I do to NPCs, which is, I think, one of the big reasons I like DMing over playing, is that I can just kind of switch out the hat as I want to. And also NPCs can be more one-dimensional than player characters. But yeah, that was super interesting to hear the mechanics dictate how the character deals with their problems. And it's wild to me, Tom, that you basically start with 3 archetypes ever and just go off of that. I mean, it's good. I mean, obviously it's worked out. Your characters have been great, so you obviously get variety between them.
Well, I think Jared mentioned that like you're playing a character, and well, I know how I like to play combat, and those 3 are kind of like that's the triangle of how I like to play combat. So
Yeah.
but I don't like the idea necessarily that like certain character types are married or divorced from certain types of characters. So, for example,
Which is fair.
guy
I
with
think that's
swords
a
is a
big
very
thing. That's a
broad term. It's like we have like the I guess stereotypical fighter / barbarian who's a little dumber and rough and tough, but it's like you don't have to. You could make any character you want that just happens to use swords.
Yeah, and I think that was a big thing 5e specifically in D&D terms moved away from, is that they took out a lot of requirements for making a class tied to for choosing a class tied to ability scores and all that sort of jazz, to break apart from some of those archetypes.
Yeah, it's less about the archetypes of the classical archetype sort of thing, and mostly just like the choices that you make in like character creation should in some way mirror the choices that your character made going down that path in the first place. So like you say, like there's sword person, and there's basically a lot of archetypes associated with sword person, but
You
the
really can do
building of
whatever.
yeah, you can do whatever you want, but there are other choices that are a little more specific. So like why would a wizard go into illusion magic? What ideas are they playing with by thinking of false reality and stuff like that? Or why does someone want to go into time magic? Is it necessarily a sort of fool's journey to change the past or something along those lines? It can inspire a character choice,
It
which
can
is
be,
what that's what I always navigate it with.
but as much as it can inspire it, and sometimes it does. Like my magician or my wizard is a wizard because he's a scrawny dude who's afraid of getting hit. So he wants to be he learns magic and tries to stay as far away from the front lines as possible. And that kind of his mechanic ties into how his character's made. But sometimes it could just very well be like any other character we have could be a wizard with their personality. It doesn't have to be tied to it.
Yeah, I think Jared's saying the same thing as
Yes.
you. It's just
Yeah, I just want to sum it all up.
to clarify. Yeah, because at the end of the day, anything you're doing when you're playing a character, anything you're doing in life, if you want to extend it that far, is just constantly dealing with problems that arise, right?
Yeah.
So I think Jared's sentence of mechanics dictate how mechanics should, rather, by the definition of most systems, dictate how this person is going to deal with their problems, can really help define a character and bring them out of their shell. Similarly, if you design a character like me, which is to say barely at all, and then you're trying to figure out what the hell to do with it, I think turning to mechanics to figure out how that fits in can be hugely beneficial. Fate, one of the systems we've talked about plenty of times now, their system for sort of coming up with abilities is literally just what's a common problem that you face and how do you deal with it? And you can come up with like 3 to 4 of them, which is a beautiful melding of story, specifically backstory and mechanics. So if your character is a literal slime ball who often needs to slink around because they can't fight back as a literal slime ball, one of the mechanical abilities you can just create for yourself is that you, slip through vents really easily because you grew up on a space station or something like that. And that's mind blowing to me that it can just tie that together so quick. And I think the connection point, a similar connection point, is more difficult to achieve in many systems, but it's not impossible either way.
Yeah, ultimately it comes down to just what are you taking as inspiration for your character? Because you can be inspired by mechanics, you can be inspired by archetypes before, you can be inspired by a character you saw on TV. It's just a matter of picking a direction and going with it. Because you can deviate off that path as you go. It's not necessarily set in stone. It's just a matter of, like, you don't have to do it all yourself. That sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, we ended up talking for a while, and I'm glad we went a little bit more in depth into the things we wanted to talk about tonight. But I think that is the time we've allotted for ourselves for this episode.
I agree.
Okay.
So,
okay.
This episode has been brought to you by unsurprisingly, I should say, not Raid Shadow Legends. It was all us.
Absolutely no one supported us besides our
Not-
friends and family. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and
You guys' family supported you.
No.
Someone somewhere has probably supported this podcast, so thank you for being you. Until the next time we decide we all want to get together and do episode 5, this has been the Three Sided Dice Podcast.
Have a good night or day.
Or
Or
don't.
even-
bye.
We're not in charge of
We're
you.
not your boss.
We're
Yeah.
not in charge of your life. Have a good one.